Hello and welcome to another special from Let Them Eat Cake. Today we'll be covering Manipur state in the northeast of India, where we're seeing ethnic clashes, which have started from the 3rd of May and have continued through the month of May. We are seeing, because of the violence, tens of thousands of displacements, dozens of deaths, and the violence will likely continue.
Basically, what's going on is you have this northeastern state of India called Manipur, and within Manipur, you have a couple main groups. The first being the majority Hindu Meitei, who make up approximately 50% of the population and generally are overrepresented in the political elite there, in the civil service and whatnot. And then you have the Kuki tribes and other scheduled tribes in the area, such as the Zo, who are majority Christian and tend to be a bit more rural, and their homeland is in the states like hilly countryside and whatnot, versus the Métis, more urbanized Impahal Valley. And pretty much how this all started is for the past 2 decades or so, the Métis have wanted a scheduled tribe status, which is basically a status reserved to the most impoverished and poor demographics within India, who through this program benefit from land rights, some economic benefits, quotas for them to be represented in government jobs at colleges and things like that. And so pretty much how this started is that on May 3rd, the courts in Manipur agreed that the Métis should be given scheduled tribe status. However, the Kuki and the Zo believe that the Métis already benefit a lot within Manipur, as they make up the majority of people in politics, government positions, etc., and that this would also give them rights to what the Kuki see as their land in the countryside and things of that nature. Whereas the Métis already sort of control a lot of land in the mostly urbanized Impahal Valley of the state. So for a lot of the Kuki and the Zo, this just doesn't make a lot of sense to them as to why a group that already has so much, I guess you could say, like political and government control, and is already represented in a lot of the government sectors, as to kind of why they would get this, whereas the Kuki who do benefit from this scheduled tribe status don't get nearly as much help out or quotas from the government to be involved in the civil service or to get into colleges and things of that nature. So after the authorities in Manipur approved this scheduled tribe status for the Métis, or said that the Métis should get it, what happened is that a bunch of students from the Kuki and the other tribes within Manipur went out and they protested. And so from that point on, things just got really violent. Gangs being formed on the street, people's houses and property have been burned, churches belonging to the Kuki and other tribes in the area have been burned, just kind of due to this amount of violence. You would see like a lot of, like, for example, Métis gangs forming on trucks armed with weapons, armed with machetes, armed with bats, guns, going out and destroying Kuki and Zo property. And the violence was so bad that the Indian army had to step in to quell the violence, to kind of come in as like a quote unquote like peacekeeping force. And they've enforced curfews, they've cut off the internet in the area, and just kind of due to the violence has gone on since May 3rd, we're looking at least 54 people who have been killed by the violence and at least 50,000 people who have been displaced by the violence. Now, mind you, these are very conservative estimates because the violence is still very much ongoing in the area. Video footage of mostly Kuki and Zo people fleeing to their like traditional homelands in the hills of the country. We saw armed Kuki and Zo tribal groups involved in clashes and firefights with the Indian army. The violence has just escalated to kind of an uncontrollable point. The UN isn't there. There aren't a lot of human rights groups that are there. And it's a conflict that has a lot of historical implications in this particular region or state of India. The socioeconomic difference between the two groups has been pretty apparent for a while now, hundreds of years, I would say. So, Uday, you got anything to add about that?
Yeah, to add to what you're saying, there's been a lot of portrayal of this recently as a religious conflict. especially in Indian media, with the Métis being majority Hindu, although they are some Muslims and other groups within them, and the Kukis and the Chins and the Zos and the Mizos, who are mainly majority Christians. So historically, Manipur has been a kingdom, and it has been ruled by a lot of Meitei dynasties and families. And in the same time, you have the Kukis and Chins living there, because this whole area borders Myanmar, where there's hundreds of different ethnic groups. Every village you go to, you'll meet people of different groups. It's a very similar environment here, and the tribal groups within India, especially in the northeast, this area has been racked by insurgency by different tribal groups in different states. Many have called for their own statehood. Some have been successful, some have not been. But the tribal groups in Manipur, which is the Nagas and the Kukis, have historically been calling for an area where they have their own administration, because Manipur does have a majority of Meitei people, but as was mentioned, the Meiteis are politically and economically at a higher level than the tribal groups. And so this recent flare up of violence is because by the Manipur court saying that the Meiteis can be considered a tribal group, they would be allowed to access a lot of the land and resources that were available to the Kukis and the other ethnic groups there. So this is the crux of the situation. It's not really a religious conflict in that sense, but yeah, the violence has pretty much gone on for nearly 2 months now. If we add on another 10 days, I don't see it getting better in the next 10 days. And there's been thousands of homes destroyed and churches and temples too. Like, the violence is both sides now. It's not just a Meitei majority versus a Kuki minority. So there's armed tribal groups and armed groups on all sides. Some of them are backed by the government. There have been allegations that security forces have been favoring some of the Meitei groups. There is information on how some of the groups got weapons. It was from police armories that were given to them, by the members of the tribe. And there has been an overall lack of coordination between security forces, because the police are divided on one side between their own tribal allegiances, and on the other side the central government is trying to do its thing. But there's a lot of accusations on both sides that security forces are just ignoring one side or the other, or facilitating violence, or not getting involved. And right now what's happened is all the Kukis have left the Imphal Valley, and all the Metes have left the tribal areas, and there's no-go zones, there's blockades, and there's shutdown. Like, people will stop cars on the street and see who's in it and who's going where, that kind of thing, and they're armed. Also, there's gunfights nearly every day. Yeah, so it's a really messy situation.
Has any refugees from Myanmar fueled any of this stuff as well? Like, is that a part as well?
Yeah, that's been a major part of why tensions have been rising between the communities in Manipur in the last few years. So, since the civil war in Myanmar started in February 2021, there's been a lot of displaced people coming from Myanmar into India. Some of these groups, like the Chins, they share more of an ethnic history with the Kukis and the Mizos. And so the Metes have seen this influx of foreigners coming in, and they've been accusing them of increasing drug dealing, increasing insecurity. And the Manipur government, which is led by the central government, the Bharatiya Janata Party. It has a Mete guy in power, and he, over the last few years, has been saying that all the Chins and Kukis are drug dealers, and trying to create more divisions. So, in the last few months, also, in fact, over the last year, there's been a lot of anti drug drives in Manipur, which are supposed to target these narco tribal groups. But for the tribal groups, it's like they're being targeted because they're being associated with drug dealers and this and that and other criminality. So that's been rising tensions, and that's what adds to a lot of the polarization. Because even if you see the narrative in Indian media today, it's that these guys have come from Myanmar. They're all drug dealers. They're all criminals, whatever. And the Meiteis. This is the Meitei state, and it should be that. But these tribal groups have been demanding their own administration for decades now.
Just to kind of establish something, this like state in India only has about like 3.5 million people. For this scale of violence to be this widespread, it's pretty much safe to say everyone in the state has been affected in some way or the other by the degree of violence that's going on.
Sorry.
Population wise, it's a pretty small state by Indian standards. That would be
Yeah,
correct. Mhm.
yeah. It's smaller than a big city.
What do you define as a big city in India, though?
I mean, Mumbai or Delhi. Delhi's a big city. The whole national capital region has like what 20, 25 million people.
That's the entire population of Australia.
I think it's more than that actually. What are you guys at? 20?
That's wild. 26, I think. When the British divvied up India, has that affected this area like it did the north?
Yeah, because even Myanmar at that time, British Burma, was under British dominion basically, and a lot of these states, India gained independence in 1947, but a lot of northeast states were created in the time after because of these different tribal and ethnic kind of populations that they had there. And the British borders for Burma did cut through ethnic tribes and like the Kukis and the Chins and all of that across the 1,000 kilometer border. So yeah, I mean, if you draw a line through on a map, you are gonna add detentions, in the area and cut off people, and yeah, that's definitely been a thing. So that's why there's a lot of polarization now. Like some of the Métis, what they want is they want a national register of citizens in which they will be classified as the original citizens of India, and they want the more tribal guys to be classified as immigrants or foreigners, so they have more rights.
Interesting. It's funny. It has a lot of parallels with a lot of things.
Yeah.
It rhymes a lot with a lot of other conflicts. It's very interesting. Has Modi been commenting on this sort of thing? Is he been getting involved?
So there's a joke about how politicians in Delhi only care about the Northeast when there's elections. And Manipur had his elections last year, and Modi said a lot about that. And the BJP, his party, did win the elections. But so far, since the 3rd of May, he has said nothing about Manipur. And this has pissed a lot of people off, even including the Métis, who have lost faith in the central government and the state government, both of which are led by the BJP. When the violence broke out on the 3rd of May, Modi was busy holding campaigns in Karnataka. So was Amit Shah and the rest of the BJP leadership, and they lost those elections. The Home Minister, Amit Shah, has come to visit Manipur, but since then, the violence really hasn't stopped. And the central government is trying to say the issues right now are because of previous governments, but they have been in power in Manipur for the last 6 years. I mean, the state government and the central government or the people, both the Kukis, the Chins, and the other tribes in Manipur are pissed off now at the state government and the central government for inaction, for not being able to resolve this. And there's a lack of faith from all sides because, yeah, the chief minister of Manipur, he was pretty pro Mete and pushing for all of these kind of things. But he hasn't been able to solve the violence or anything. So, and there's also a lot of perspectives that, some of this violence was motivated by nefarious elements for political reasons, which I could not fully discount also.
So, is there a perfect solution where everybody wins here, or what?
I mean, this whole Northeast area has always had this ethnic and tribal conflict. This has gone back hundreds of years. In others, northeastern states, there have been pretty strong insurgent groups that have, successfully called for peace deals, or the government has had to enter deals with them. This conflict's always been about land at the end of the day, and I don't see an easy resolution now, especially since people are being so polarized. Now the Métis have come together as a whole to kind of reject the Kukis, and the Kukis are doing the same to the Métis, that kind of thing, because they've lost so much faith in each other and faith in any central authority. Even if things quiet down, this mistrust will continue, and it can't flare up easily over something else. If there's a protest that goes violent or something, it could get back to this. So no easy solution at the moment.
The states surrounding here, are they majority Hindu, or have they got the same issues?
Some of the states have majority Hindus. Some of the states have tribal groups. There's a lot of tribal groups in this area, like especially Mizoram and Nagaland. See, most of the conflict here hasn't been just a purely religious issue. Religion just gets tacked on, as an additional thing. And it, for someone staying outside of the northeast of India, when they're reading the news, or seeing what's on TV, they'll see it as a religious issue. But for the people there, it's not really a religious issue. It's more about the land, tribal, ethnic rights, and their own history, which is really complex and really mixed up.
One thing we have heard a lot about in this conflict is that like a lot of there are a lot of displaced people kind of shifting in and out of certain areas. Have camps been set up by the Indian military or police or whoever, or is it just kind of people going back to like family homes in more rural areas, or is it a mix of both? What's the
No.
accommodation
Yeah.
looking like for like displaced people in this area?
Yeah, there are camps being built because for some people, their family homes are the ones that got burned down. You know, if they were
Right.
living in an Nepal, or if Métis family homes in the tribal areas got burned down. So those were their family homes. So there are people living in camps. All the Métis dominated areas, in those areas, there's pretty much no cookies at the moment, and in the more tribal areas, there's a movement of Métis out. So there's been a lot of internal displacements. There's been some people moving out of the state also. So yeah, people are living in camps, and it's a pretty grim situation at the moment.
The camps in the country, are they commissioned by the Indian Army and the police, or who's setting these camps up?
It should be under, for an emergency like this, it'll be the central government or the home ministry that kind of does that, and it directs the security forces to maintain security there, and it's a centralized effort. I'm not sure which authority in particular would be looking over camps specifically, but along with the deployment of military, this is a centralized effort kind of thing, and national relief forces, rescue and disaster management also.
We do hear like some reports of like abuses going on in these camps, and maybe just due to the lack of coordination between the security forces, like the police, the state police over in Manipur and the Indian Army. Would you say that maybe certain tribal groups are being like unfairly targeted by police in these camps, or by the army in these camps?
Yeah, more so by the police, because a lot of the lack of coordination comes from the police doing what they're doing based on their ethnic lines, versus the state security forces coming in and they're ordered to manage the situation, but the police are giving weapons to a certain group or another group. I mean, there's always been accusations of this, as you had said. The Métis are politically overrepresented, and there are a lot of high level Métis police commissioners, politicians. The tribal groups have always had an issue with the police. They have an issue with the whole administration of how things have been. That's why they want their own separate territory, because politically, socially, and even from a security aspect, they've always kind of been discriminated against by the more Métis majority. That's definitely a factor, and I'm not surprised if there will be more of these allegations. And what's worrying is the internet shutdown, because you can hide a lot of information in that, and
India seems to do internet shutdowns a lot to respond to things,
I
from
think
what I've
it's
seen.
the second or third highest country, like in terms of ranking of the number of internet shutdowns it does. It's pretty high. Like for anything, any kind of unrest, there the first thing will be to shut down the internet to prevent news of it getting out. It's also to prevent groups from organizing and all of that.
Could it
Um,
also be to prevent it from spreading?
yeah, sometimes.
Something that the population widely agreed
Yeah,
with. I feel like a population that large could become
yeah.
a very big issue for the government.
So you see that happen in cases when there's communal violence, such as between Hindus and Muslims in some areas. And then to control the situation in the area, authorities will shut down internet, prevent the kind of narratives and propaganda from spreading. But at the end of the day, that does happen, especially when there is silence on issues and there's nothing clear from the authorities on, what the plan is next or how we're going to tackle this. We don't have Starlink up here, and I don't think we're going to get it.
Just kind of just speaking a little bit more from an anecdotal perspective and what I've noticed. Obviously, the internet shutdowns are a very calculated move by the Indian government whenever they do happen, and
Yeah.
that just kind of seems to be because anytime there's any sort of news about India coming from any outlet or in and it's news about India in any way, it seems to just spread like wildfire and reach a lot of people in India. So, I mean,
Yeah,
I guess you could say, like, if you're the Indian government, it would be quote unquote wise to censor the internet, just because anything about India that ends up in the news is just going to be on everyone's phone from like New Delhi to Mumbai in hours, which
yeah.
kind of goes for everywhere, but it seems to be like a more prevalent phenomenon in India.
I think one of the longest internet shutdowns that was done was in Kashmir in 2016, when they killed a popular militant leader. And over the next few months, at least 1,000 people were blinded in protest when Indian security forces were shooting pellet guns at protesters. So, yeah, there's a lot of reasons for shutdowns. It's to prevent, some of what's really happening getting out. It's to prevent violence from spreading. Also, it's to kind of maintain narratives. So, I mean, there's a whole heap of factors that contribute.
So right now, Modi's in the U.S. Do you think this even comes up?
Nah, not at all. But the only little trouble he got was from that one question when he took a press conference for the first time in, I don't know, 10 years or something, and they asked him about religious discrimination in India against Muslims, and he's like, "No, we're a democracy. We value human rights." Um, that was a, I think that's the only kind of pressure he would have got, and that's from like a member of press in America. I don't think the politicians in America, or at least like Biden or any of them, they're more concerned about the whole China thing, so they want Modi on their side.
Yeah, that's the first thing I see here. You see the
Right.
quad. This is the joint statement right here. So you
Yeah,
see the quad down here. It says creating a technology partnership for the future.
yeah,
Here's the thing. They're doing this thing. Uh,
Like,
NASA space stuff in here.
a bunch of drones also.
Co-development.
Yeah,
yeah,
That's what I'm
so
looking for. That's what I'm looking for before.
that's something I did want to get into, because a week before Modi even arrived, a deal had been put in place
yeah.
for India to basically get 31 of the MQ-9B Sea Guardian drones, and it's the worth of these 31 drones is a little over $3 billion. And from my understanding is that these drones basically deal in like naval reconnaissance. So is there anything there, like, kind of in the sense that the U.S. is giving India these drones because in security with China, and sort of any sort of issues or flare-ups with China, they all tend to be sort of naval based, and they tend to do with ships kind of crossing in and out of Chinese or Indian or American waters. So would you say that the deal, or like the India's procurement of these drones, is kind of the U.S. looking to bolster the naval capabilities of its allies in a sense?
The U.S. is also trying to position itself more favorably to India, but India has also wanted to modernize its military, especially given the threat of China, which has taken over bits of Arunachal Pradesh, which is in the northeast. India has fought wars with China in the past, and those were land based. I mean, India overall sees China as a big threat. I'm not sure about these drones specifically, of their naval capabilities, or whether they can be used in the mountainous areas also. But you have Pakistan on the other side, where China has a lot of investment also, and China has a pearl of strings across the Indian Ocean. So India is quite wary about Chinese naval incursions and Chinese naval activity. So it has been trying to boost its army, navy, air force, everything, because mainly because of China and Pakistan.
So on this like relief web thing up here in the corner, hang on, let me center it here. It says climate hazards. So I was curious with this area because there's three impacts that I'm interested out. First of all, pollution. That's separate from like the destruction of land, because land is obviously important.
Yeah.
So pollution, destruction of land, and then also just the because these are cyclones, so weather effects from climate change, or even if locusts come, stuff like that. What's actually going on up there with climate vulnerability and pollution?
The northeast region is not as polluted as the rest of India or some parts of India. It's more clean. There has been less tourism there. Tourism is something that's picking up there. But the effects of climate change are pretty harsh over there. Like you get cyclones in the Bay of Bengal every year, um, and they hit from Bangladesh to Myanmar to the eastern coast of India. Right now, it's flooding in Assam, which is another state in the northeast, also. And I mean, there's floods every year in Assam, and they've just been getting worse and worse with hundreds of people dying and that kind of stuff. Um, I I'm not a scientist, so but I think like the rising global temperatures does affect the Himalayas and the ice melting from there, and that comes into the northern bits of India, the northeast. This whole area is a very mountainous, especially if you go to Arunachal Pradesh, like snow-capped heights, that kind of thing. So it all comes down, and yeah, there has been a lot of displacement over the last few years. I think a couple months ago there was Cyclone Morcha in Myanmar that destroyed a lot of things and hundreds of people were killed. And so, yeah, this area is very prone to weather events. And the thing is, there isn't much infrastructure in the Northeast. It isn't as well developed as the rest of India. And for example, if a highway is cut between two states, that's normally the main point between the two states, so that also hampers rescue and relief efforts and connectivity. There have been times when there have been massive protests in another state in the Northeast, and that has cut off connectivity to between the Northeast because just of the geography there. So it's a very unfriendly kind of geography.
One thing I did want to backtrack to a little bit, and we just touched on this, but we did just talk about earlier how the Indian government kind of slanders or labels a lot of the scheduled tribes as being drug dealers from Myanmar and whatnot. Obviously, that's wrong, but when it does come to the drug trade, we do know that the trade of heroin and just drugs in general is very prevalent in Myanmar. So when it comes to this particular region of India, who's actually responsible for drug trafficking from Myanmar into these parts of India?
Okay, so across from Manipur, there are drugs that come in, and it is some of the tribal groups who are involved in the trafficking and stuff, but who are involved in getting manufacturing the drugs themselves and all of that. It's members of all communities, and these are guys who do have some level of, you know, they have some politician friends or some friends in the police force, that kind of thing. This is pretty high up. It is pretty high level corruption. There have been, I think, a couple of years ago, there was a high up police officer from Manipur who resigned because of some pressure because she was trying to uncover a drug ring which implicated politicians, maybe tribal people bringing it over the border or transporting packs to it being manufactured and processed and all of that. So everyone's kind of involved in it. If it's a money thing, everyone's going to try to take their cut somewhere.
Right.
So it wouldn't be fair at all to say that the drugs are just coming in because of the tribes. That's not the case.
Right. Anyone who's transporting is sort of enabled by the police and politicians who might want
Yeah.
to take a pay cut. All right. Yeah.
And the demand for it, right? So
If people, what's like the transportation infrastructure like in these areas? Like, is it mostly if you wanted to travel from town to town or state to state, would it be like train based? Are there highways that run through these areas, or is
yeah,
there just not much infrastructure at all? Like,
so air travel is limited. Not all places have airports. All the states will have an airport, but smaller cities within them will not have airports. There are trains and there are buses. That's the main way for most people to go, trains and buses. There are highways also, but I mean, it depends on the conditions, and not everyone can afford a car or to hire a car. There's a lot of transport on highways by trucks, though. Most of the goods that come into Manipur, in the northeast, because it is landlocked, come by land.
To be serious, this document, I mean, this is a huge document. If I just like speed this up and scroll through, like I've just still been scrolling through on this is like all the stuff that they agreed to together. Like this is what they've been like this is a lot of shit that him and the Prime Minister of India went through. So let me just do a quick control F on Manipur and see if it did come up.
No,
I know, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt.
that has pissed a lot of people
Oh,
off. It's
zero
been
zero
nearly two
results.
months. It's been 2 months, and the Prime Minister of India has said nothing about the violence going on.
It just kind of speaks to how fucked it is, because like when you think about like the fact that we are using conservative estimates here, we're talking like at least somewhere between the range of 50 to 100 people have been killed, and you're talking about like 50,000 people just like displaced from their homes. That's a crisis literally anywhere else. Insane how you can't comment on it for like 2 months. I'm just thinking about it right now. It's like, could you imagine here in the US, for example, if Rhode Island, there was a bunch of violence that popped up and like 100+ people were killed, the internet got shut off, and like 50,000 people had to leave their houses.
Yeah.
And like, imagine if the president just never said anything about it.
He'll say a lot of things for random shit he shouldn't come into, and involve himself in a lot of things, especially when it comes to this Hindu Muslim thing. He'll talk his ass off on that, but on this he's just been completely silent.
This is one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight it, because hopefully people will appreciate somebody actually talking about this.
One thing I do want to bring up really quick is we have mentioned Hindu Muslim violence in India, and it's kind of like,
Yeah.
but when it comes to this stuff, is it like tribal stuff? Is it random acts of discriminatory violence? What does it look like?
There are random acts of violence. Some of the trends that's been happening, if there's a big Hindu festival, some of these more hardline Hindu groups will go in Muslim areas, and in front of mosques they'll start playing music really loud, and tell them to break it down, that kind of thing. And that's been setting off some violence. So there is that, but there's also like a very kind of nefarious and organized violence to the Gujarat 2002 riots. They were organized to quite a degree, and the government was complicit in that. In 2020 or 2021, when there were anti-Muslim riots in New Delhi, the capital, there were BJP politicians before that saying that people should arm themselves and get ready to kill people, that kind of thing. And when the riots happened, the police weren't on the ground, or the police were not protecting the Muslim side of things. So, you do get in more rural areas, you do get random acts of violence, and just the tensions that build up and manifest between the two communities, because it has become so polarized. But there's also definitely a level of higher planning in some of the larger incidents of violence, because those are facilitated and those are allowed to happen.
What's Modi's response to this stuff usually like? Because it's like I can't even though he is part of like a right-wing party and whatnot, I can't imagine that the Prime Minister of India is just openly saying like, all right guys, go out there and kill some Muslims. What is it like? Is it just a lot of grifting and shiftiness, or what is it?
Back in the 2000s, it was more direct when he was chief minister of the state. He didn't publicly say that, but he has indicated that and let that happen. Right now it's very measured, but politicians within his party, in 2020 or 2021, there was a politician also in the ruling party. He said, let's go shoot all these. He cursed Muslims. He's like, let's go shoot all of them. So Modi doesn't directly have to say anything himself at this point. And he'll come to America and he'll talk about, we have human rights in India, we have democracy in India. But his silence and is basically a facilitation in a sense.
So if you look here, literally Obama, he did an interview with CNN, and it's saying he specifically is talking about the protecting the rights of minority groups in India. So while Biden is making the deals, Obama is at least directly calling him out. Not like it matters. He's not going to do anything.
Yeah,
But
this pissed off a lot of like right wing Hindus. Or they're calling him Hussein Obama. They're saying like, oh, he's not the president and all of that. And
what I was going to wrap with is you were just you were bringing up violence of like stuff being organized violence, and then like police protecting one side. I just wanted to say like this stuff is not to simplify or downplay anything, but this is stuff that we see in our own countries. It's to a different degree. These are tactics that we see globally going on by governments. And only by going out and understanding and looking at how similar a lot of things are here do we begin to understand how the hierarchy in these systems work to keep us down and divided.